From the studio of Blackwater Media in the great city of Atlanta, I'm Dr. William Lester. If you enjoyed the Dogman files, I have a special surprise for you. Welcome to Blackwater Media's Dogman Files Part 2. I've never talked about this before. It's something that I saw about 5 years ago. There have been instances since that time that I considered telling someone but could never work up the courage. I just assumed that people would think I was either crazy, delusional, or just making it up. But I decided it was more important to share this experience, to let people know that these kinds of things are real. And I thought maybe someone else has had a similar experience. Somehow it's comforting to know that somewhere out there are others who can relate to what happened to me. So like I said, it was about 5 years ago. I've always been kind of a night owl and was up late every night watching TV, reading, or listening to music. It wasn't uncommon for me to, at least once or twice a week, fall asleep in my chair in the den. If I remember correctly, it was a Thursday night, Friday morning, and I must have dozed off in the chair maybe around 2 or 2:30. Anyway, I woke up about an hour later. The TV was still on, but the volume was down to a minimum. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 3:17. Then a strange sensation came over me. For whatever reason, a powerful feeling of fear washed over me like a damn tidal wave. And that's when I glanced out the window. Now let me tell you, what I saw out in my front yard was the most horrifying thing you can imagine and way beyond any nightmare I've ever had. Standing there looking directly back at me was the biggest wolf I've ever seen. I mean, this damn thing was easily bigger than a horse. It was long and shaggy, and it just stood there motionless, glaring at me with eyes that were hot yellow. What I saw in those eyes was pure hatred and absolute malevolence. I turned my head, pretending not to look, but cut my eyes to the right so I could still see it. After another minute or two, the creature raised its snout and sniffed up in the air. Then it started to slowly walk off to the left. I watched it until it disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for the rest of the morning, probably in a state of shock. I remember eventually getting up to make some coffee, and I even dropped off on a short nap later on in the afternoon. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what the hell that wolf thing was and why it stood out there staring at me. To this day, I still can't answer those questions. But I can tell you this. When the sun goes down, beware of things that walk the night. I'm currently a resident of Altoona, Pennsylvania. I wanted to share a strange encounter I experienced with a friend of mine in the early morning hours of Sunday, March 17th of 2013. I've chosen up till now not to talk about this event due to an unwillingness to expose myself or my family and friends to public scrutiny. In light of a recent spate of similar sightings in central Pennsylvania, I've changed my mind. Perhaps our experience will help with the current research. As such, I'd like to make my intention clear, that myself and any persons mentioned be able to retain anonymity at this time. You see, reporting a Bigfoot or even a UFO sighting is one thing, but this is something entirely different. On the evening in question, a friend and I were returning from a job in Williamsburg. My friend was driving. To the best of my recollection, the incident occurred somewhere between 1:30 a.m. and 2 a.m. on the morning of March 17th. Although spring was only a few days away, there was still some snow on the ground. We were traveling southwest on Route 22 through a rural suburb of Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. As we rounded a little curve in the road, our attention was drawn to our left on the opposite side of the road. Standing or semi-squatting in a clearing a few feet off the side of the road was some kind of creature. Now, my friend wasn't driving very fast and slowed a bit as we approached. Our initial view of it was from its dorsal side as it was facing away from us. It came into profile as we passed with its right side to us. It struck me immediately that the creature had a combination of both human and canine features. It was squatting down on its legs close to the ground, but was doing so in a bipedal fashion. The legs had the stifle joint of a hawk, characteristic of a canine, not like a human leg. It had its front limbs or arms in front of it, and I believe it was possibly crouched over something, maybe a smaller animal it had killed. Now, this thing's arms were long in proportion to its body. I recall thinking the hands were more human-like as opposed to paws. Its torso seemed to be somewhat hunched forward. I had the impression that at any moment it could have gone to all fours quite comfortably. The creature's chest was not broad like a human's, but had a pronounced forward angle breastbone like a canid. It gave the impression of great strength, having distinct and well-defined musculature, but was not built on a massive frame. It seemed more thin and sinewy. If it had stood fully erect, I would estimate that the creature would have been close to 7 feet tall. It was covered in fur that was grayish silver in color. The creature seemed unnaturally shiny, although this could have been a reflection from the headlights or the moon. It had pointy, erect canine ears that were somewhat laid back on its head. The head was large and very wolf-like overall in appearance. The muzzle was also very wolf-like, although the snout wasn't exceptionally elongated. It had canine teeth, though. To the best of my recollection, the eyes were an amberish color, but again, that may have been the reddish glow reflection to them. They had a wolf-like tail. It turned its head to watch us and tracked us as we passed. It seemed quite aware of our presence, and it let out a chilling howl that filled the night air. My friend and I continued in stunned silence for a few moments. When the creature was no longer in view, I turned and asked my friend what we'd just seen. His exact words were, "We just saw a fucking werewolf." I agreed that that's pretty much my own assessment. I asked if he'd turn the car around, but he absolutely refused to do so. It's probably just as well. We spent the rest of the trip debating as to whether it could have been a dog or even someone's escaped pet wolf, but to be honest, it just wasn't. I'm sure of that. Both my friend and I are experienced outdoorsmen, and neither one of us has ever seen anything fitting that description before. I was actually raised not far from the area and know it quite well. I've spoken to my friends about this, and we'd both be willing to take a polygraph concerning this incident. Since that time, I've learned that what we saw that night is what people call Dogman. There's a lot being said about these creatures on the internet over the last few years. A lot of interesting stuff, and a lot of deep, steamy bullshit. But I can tell you one damn thing for sure. These creatures exist. One of the earliest accounts of a Dogman encounter in the United States goes back to the last 2 decades of the 1800s, out in what was known then as the Arizona Territory. Now, of course, when you mention the American Southwest in relation to this, some people automatically think of Native Americans, the Navajo in particular, which leads to the inevitable conversation about skinwalkers. But this story has nothing to do with skinwalkers or shape-shifting or any of the other subjects that sometimes get dragged down into the Dogman discussion. Now, some of you have heard about some of the things that went down in Tombstone, Arizona. That's right. What I want to tell you about happened around the time that Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Doc Holliday were establishing themselves as permanent historical fixtures of what we now call the Old West. But it was another man, a man named William Arnett, now largely obscured by time, who was engaged in exploits no less exciting. Arnett was a Texan and was known to have done a stint as a ranger. But he had, over a period of time, worked as an Army scout, bounty hunter, and was known to be an expert tracker. It was this reputation that brought him to the Arizona Territory, Cochise County to be precise. You see, between Nugent's Pass and Bisbee, there were more than 24 ranches that had been experiencing what at the time was being called strange goings-on. This included sheep, chickens, and cattle being attacked in the middle of the night and eaten, in whole or in part. Of course, this was initially attributed to coyotes, but the severity of the mutilation suggested a larger predator, a much larger predator. But more than that, there were even reports of a strange creature skulking around the outskirts of many of these ranches, just as dusk fell. It was described as a wolf as big as a buffalo, a wolf that could stand up on 2 legs and walk like a man. Now, the men who were able to catch a glimpse of the creature were only ever able to get off a few random shots at it until it scrambled out of sight. The last ranch to be struck was the Gadsden place near Packard, just west of Bisbee. The scene was the same as all the rest. Cattle gutted, ripped, mutilated, and half-eaten. The ranch foreman, a man named Russell, described his discovery as blood and guts scattered out over an acre and a half of the property. After that, several of the largest ranch owners met and agreed to bring Arnett in. He was, they figured, their best hope. Besides, how much longer would it be before whatever it was turned its attention to people? William Arnett, having received the urgent telegram, replied, gathered the necessary supplies, and headed south. Upon his arrival, Arnett met with a group of the larger ranch owners, with Benton Gadsden at the lead. The ranchers brought him up to speed on exactly what had been taking place, including dates, times, weather conditions, and so forth. They all knew that by reputation, Arnett was a quick study and in short order would be out and after the monster wolf. Gadsden provided Arnett with lodgings, and that first night, several of the men dined at his table. You see, Gadsden had started the ranch after coming out west from Ohio after the surrender of General Lee. Since then, he built it up to one of the largest ranches in the territory. He was an honest and well-respected man, and when something troubled and upset him, it was troubling and upsetting for everyone, especially the other ranchers. The next 2 days and nights were uneventful, at least according to Arnett. He spent most of that time out scouting around the area, including the locations of reported sightings of the creature. It was said that at the time he didn't talk much, just a nod and an occasional word in morning or evening greeting, but was seen regularly writing in what looked to be a leather-bound journal. Nobody at that time, nor for years, decades after, had the faintest idea about the contents of the pages within. The sun rose and shone brightly on the 3rd day, and things seemed very much as they had been on the previous 2 days. Arnett was out and about, having been seen at various points by the ranch hands along Rattlesnake Pass, Whitby Spring, Corbin's Trail, and others. However, later on, as the sun set beneath the distant hills, all hell broke loose. It started with barking dogs kicking up a ruckus and the sound of a horse, most assumed to be Arnett, tearing ass through a meadow. Then, somewhere out in the darkness, a terrible howl. Behind that was the distinctive sound of Arnett Sharp's 1874 rifle. The night air began to fill with the anger and fury of the chase and the hunt. Some of the men, the ranch hands, peered out in the night from lantern-lit windows, the yellowish-orange haze being visible at a distance. Others, with a few more grains of courage, had taken lanterns out to the perimeter fences, thinking they might see something of the action. What would later be known as the general melee seemed to go on and on through the night, but in truth, it was probably no more than about 20 minutes. The air was choked with the smell of oil and smoke, dust, wood, and leather. Finally, things fell silent. Then the men could hear the sound of what must have been Arnett coming back across the meadow on horseback. They started gathering around as he rode up. "The thing is done," Arnett said. "Come and see." The men scrambled out behind Arnett's horse, back down to the meadow with the amber glow of more than a dozen lanterns leading the way. Further down, in the midst of the high grass, they saw a monstrous form lying dead on the ground. It seemed as though the rumors were true. A wolf, big as a buffalo, black as midnight, that could walk on two legs. Even in the darkness, the men could see the different points at which Arnett's shots had successfully struck home. Then Arnett looked at the men, gave a slight nod, and rode off. No one rightly knows what the bounty was on the creature. Some say $5,000 or $10,000. Hell, there were reports in the tombstone epitaph that it was as high as $25,000. All I can report with certainty is that at least half of his bounty was paid in gold. Reports and sightings of Arnett get kind of sketchy after that. A lot of rumors and whispering was swirled up into folklore. Stories about some weird lizard thing he took out after down in Louisiana Bayou country. There was some other yarn about him mixing it up with a Navajo shaman and a handful of others, including a run-in with the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia. But those have to wait for another time. Suffice it to say, William Arnett is a true hero of what we now call the Old West, although his exploits, as I said, carried him to nearly all points of the compass. And as we know now, that included going head-to-head with a ravenous, vicious Dogman.
You know, a girl's life could sure be a lot simpler if Chevrolet didn't make such fabulous sports cars. I love this new Chevelle SS 396. Nikki says it's Chevy's tough one. All I know is, when we move out, the other cars move over. Or take Chevy's Corvette. It won't hold more than Ross and myself. But then is that really bad? I mean, who else do the two of us really need? And besides, the Corvette's not the kind of sports car you usually see around. Unless you're awfully quick. And this is the new Monte Carlo SS. Makes me feel so elegant when I ride in it. Yes, a girl's life can really get complicated when you love to run around in every sports car Chevrolet makes. And you can lose a lot of sleep, too.
If you look at a map of the state of Georgia, you'll see that the St. Mary's River forms the southernmost border of the state. When you cross the river at that point, you're into Florida. I enjoy fishing at the northwestern stretch of the river, near the town of Folkestone. There's lots of little streams and creeks where you can fish for bluegill, crappie, and even bass. I usually park my truck just a few yards from the bank, whip out my cooler, tackle box, folding chair, radio, and enjoy a few hours of fishing and relaxation. One particular Saturday in May of 2018, I'd gone down to one of my favorite little spots with the idea of catching enough for a nice fish fry with extra to go into the freezer for the following weekend. I usually did the basic thing, flour them down and toss them into a cast iron skillet. and enjoy them with some coleslaw and home fries. Anyway, I did end up with a decent catch, enough for my plans anyway, and I'd gotten everything broken down and back onto the truck by about 7:30 that evening. As I pulled back onto the highway, I took notice of how fantastic the early stages of sunset was on the river. I'd easily be home by dark. Now, I'd barely gotten a mile down the highway when I happened to glance over to my left. About 20 yards off the highway, there was a marshy area with high reeds. My eyes happened to catch movement down by the edge of the water. At first, I thought maybe a deer or maybe even a bear might have come down to the water's edge to drink. I slowed down a little bit to see if I could get a better look, and then decided to just go ahead and pull off to the side of the road. If I was lucky, I wouldn't scare it off. So I stepped out of the truck, and the minute I did, I knew that I'd made a huge mistake. At that moment, this thing rose up out of the grass, and when it did, I heard what sounded like bone snapping. I can remember quietly mouthing the words, "What the fuck is that thing?" It looked like a giant black wolf, except that it was standing on two goddamn legs. Now, when I say giant, I mean that from the distance away that I was, I could tell that this creature was about 8 feet tall. I was frozen in place. I saw it sniff the air, and then it turned and looked right at me. I could see it had crazy orange eyes, and it squinted its eyes, then let out a deep growl and took a few steps in my direction. Now that's all it took to snap me out of my trance, because I jumped my ass back into the truck and tore off down the highway. All the way home, my hands gripped the wheel like a vice, and I was sweating like a racehorse. Every so often, I glanced into the rearview mirror just to be sure that it wasn't chasing after me. I kept glancing back until I'd gotten 2 or 3 miles from home. Once I got home, I dipped deep into the whiskey. Now, like I said before, that had been one of my favorite areas for fishing. And I haven't been back there since. And I damn sure never will go back again. It was 1998. I was 37 years old. I had been working with the Forest Department for 12 years. There was a fire in the Apalachicola National Forest that summer. The Bradwell Bay area was on fire when all this happened. The fire was raging pretty bad at this point. We didn't know if we could ever get it out. That morning I'd reported to the command center on Helen Guard Station Road to get briefed on what I would be doing that day. So me and another guy were given the task of driving around looking for animals along the road of the Bradwell Bay area. Animals would make it to the road and usually fall out if they were injured or had real bad smoke inhalation. Our job was to pick them up and take them to the vets at the command center. The vets would treat them and on some occasions euthanize the ones that wouldn't make it. So we were driving around the area heading south, doing about 45 miles per hour, faster than I should have been driving. I was talking to my partner and didn't realize how fast I was going. All of a sudden we saw a black figure run out of the woods on all fours. It ran up under my driver's side tire. I hit the animal with both the front and back tires. I was driving a 95 Dodge Ram 4x4, so I knew at that speed I had killed it. Immediately we thought it was a bear. We got out to pick the bear up and put it on the truck. Upon further investigation, we realized what I had hit was not a bear at all. It was a creature that neither one of us had ever seen. It was about 6 feet tall. It had legs, kneecaps, and feet, just like a human. The arms hung to about the knee. One arm, a matter of fact, was down by its knee. The other one was up over its head. I had run the creature over under its right underarm, across the shoulder blade, and over the back of its neck. The creature was covered in hair, about 3 to 5 inches long on the arms, legs, and head.
The hair on the back, ribs, and chest was much shorter. The muscle definition on the animal was phenomenal. It looked like a prize fighter or one of the guys you would see in the UFC. We flipped the animal over. The jaw was broken from where I had hit it with the truck. I could see, though, that it had a protruding snout, much like that of a baboon, or what you would think a werewolf looks like. It had eyes just like a human. The thing looked a lot like a chimpanzee. We quickly radioed into the command center, and they sent 2 FWC officials out to our location. Within about 15 minutes, the FWC officials arrived, and they told us that they'd never seen anything like it. So we all picked the animal up and loaded it into the back of their truck. The animal weighed about 300 to 400 pounds, which dead weight is a lot. They told us they would figure out what it was and let us know. So we had been contacted by the command center at this point, and they told us to come back and make a statement about what we saw. So we showed up at the command center, and immediately we were brought back to a room where we were to fill out an incident report. We were about 10 minutes into the incident report when we were asked to stop and wait, and that there were some people coming to see us. Within about 30 to 45 minutes, 2 government officials showed up. They walked us out to the vehicle. They were asking where we ran over the thing. We told them where it was, and so they examined the area. The truck had no damage. There was a black steel bumper on the front. The animal hit the bottom of that, and the tires took care of the rest. There was really nothing on the truck except for on the undercarriage. There was some blood and hair. The officials collected the blood and hair samples and put them away. Next, they asked us if we could get into the vehicle they came in and take them to the location where we had run over the animal. So we complied and got into the vehicle and left with the gentleman. It was a rather quiet ride back out to the spot. They didn't say much at all except for a couple of exchanges with each other. We showed up at that spot and walked them through what happened. Then all of a sudden, one of the guys, I guess the guy in charge, turned and looked at us and said, "Congratulations, fellas, you ran over a bear." I said, "Sir, but this is no bear that we hit." He quickly interrupted me with, "You don't understand. You ran over a bear." He then said that every time I tell anybody about this, to say that it was a bear. I was never to speak a word about what we actually hit. That I could face charges. My whole retirement could go away. They said I could lose my job and that they would slander me and make me look like a fool. So I looked at my partner, and we had no other choice but to comply. On the ride back, it kind of struck me as odd that this was an actual government cover-up. They knew what this thing was that we had hit. They had seen them before, and now they were in possession of a body. For some reason, they didn't want anyone to know, and they were going to great lengths to keep this under wraps. The main reason I'm telling my story is I'm hoping one of the other 3 people, my partner and the 2 FWC officials, will come forward. I figure it's a lot harder to silence 4 people than it is just 1. People need to know that these things are out there and that they are real.
A few years ago, my dad and I were out on a hunting trip together in Minnesota, where we experienced something I'll never forget. Our dog, Hudson, was sleeping in the living room, and all of a sudden he started barking. I mean, barking like a motherfucker, like he was about to smash through the door and attack whatever was out there. My dad and I went out into the living room to calm him down, but he was standing at the door, hair standing up and barking like crazy. My dad repeatedly tried to calm him down, but to no avail. Hudson started pawing at the door, all the while continuing his bark. I looked out the window expecting to see a wolf or bear wandering around, but I couldn't see anything at all. There's a motion sensor on the front of the cabin to deter the raccoons in the middle of the night, and that wasn't even tripped. Eventually, Hudson calmed down, but he was still restless the rest of the night. I could hear Hudson walking around the cabin. It was almost as if he was standing guard over the whole place. We went out on our first day of hunting, but there wasn't anything worth firing a shot at.
We went out on the porch for a cigarette, and my dad pointed out that the night was unusually quiet, and I pointed out that the day was too. Something off was going on around these woods. Hudson started barking again, even more ferocious than last night. We went back into the cabin and tried to hush him again, but he still wouldn't listen. Again, I peered out of the window, and again I found nothing, except for this time, the motion sensor was on. It wasn't on 2 minutes before. When we were out there, I began to make out movement just outside the light and strained my eyes to see past the light. I finally got my dad to look outside, and his entire demeanor changed. He wasn't so laid back anymore. He was stiffened and agitated. "That's not a goddamn bear. What the hell is it?" I went over to the gun rack and grabbed my Weatherby Vanguard rifle. My dad was instantly in front of me. "You shoot at that thing and we're going to have one hell of a problem. Just let it do its thing and wander off like it did last night." I went to the window again and looked outside. The motion sensors were off, but I could just make out movement. It was still there. Hudson quieted down and started pacing around again. I told my dad I think it left, and he looked like he was relieved. He went to the kitchen, grabbed 2 shot glasses, and poured us both some Jack Daniels, our favorite. He said he caught a glimpse of it, and it looked like a wolf, but it was too big and bulky. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I woke up to another round of Hudson's incessant barking. He was pawing at my door and barking like crazy. I glanced over at the window to the right of the bed and damn near fell out of the bed. Whatever Hudson was barking at was peering in the window. "This is no wolf. This goddamn thing is gigantic." It stared right back at me. It was furry and black, had yellow eyes, and they looked like they were glowing. Ears that were triangular and sitting on top of its head. Long canine teeth with a long wolf-like muzzle. It looked to me like it was hunched over or crouching down so it could look in the window. Then this son of a bitch licked the screen on the window. I leaped out of the bed and bolted out of the room. My dad was already awake and I started yelling at him that the thing was back outside. I grabbed my rifle again, not caring about my dad's warning, but it was already gone. My dad was right behind me and told me not to shoot, that it would just piss it off. He told me he thought it was a werewolf. I saw it with my own eyes, and it really did look like a werewolf, like from the Underworld movies. He told me that when he saw it, it was standing on 2 legs and had to be at least 8 feet tall. I moved out of the bedroom into the living room again and looked out of the window. The sensor was tripped again, but I couldn't see the thing anywhere. Eventually Hudson calmed down again and all was quiet. I continued to stare out of the window, watching for any sign of the creature's return. For the rest of the night, neither of us slept. We just waited. Every time Hudson got up, my body twitched, waiting for him to start barking again, but he never did. The sun rose and we walked around the cabin but found nothing. We trekked out into the woods but didn't go too far into it. There were no signs that a werewolf, monster, thing, whatever the hell it was, had been there the night before. I thought to myself, maybe Hudson could pick up the trail, and when I said it out loud, my dad said, "You sound like a fool." It dawned on me that I didn't actually want to find proof that this thing was out there, and I definitely didn't want to find the thing itself. My dad said we should probably just go back into the cabin and pack up. I didn't have a problem with that.
Men, no shaving proposition beats this. Listen. There's $1 cash, says Colgate Brushless wins you in a flash. Yes, $1 cash says this is it. for the clean, smooth, comfortable shaves you've always wanted. And here's why.
Because it's light and fine-textured, Colgate brushless completely surrounds, softens, and supports each bristle better than greasy, heavy creams. There's no matting down. There is no clogging. Your razor doesn't skid or skip when you use Colgate brushless. Instead, it cuts through clean and smooth.
Try Colgate brushless. See how it does away with razor scrape and soreness. Discover how slick and smooth and downright comfortable it makes your shave.
Get a large or giant-sized tube or jar of Colgate brushless shaving cream. If 1 week's use doesn't win you completely, just send me back the carton top and we'll mail you your $1. Address, Bill Stern, care of Colgate, Jersey City, Zone 2, New Jersey. Remember, there's $1 cash says Colgate brushless wins you in a flash. Real fine.
What I'm about to tell you happened to me when I was in the 5th grade. I was 10 years old. You see, I grew up in the old family home, the house my great-grandfather built for his growing family back in the 30s. I know for a fact that no one had died in the house, but I was always freaked out in it. The basement terrified me the most. The 2 generations before my mom were hoarders, pack rats. So when my mom and I moved back into her childhood home after my parents split, it was full of stuff. The basement was mainly used to store all of my great-grandfather's things since he passed a few months after my birth. This made the basement dark and cluttered, leaving creepy shadows everywhere. My mom tried to clean it up a bit and make a playroom for me. She also had a small workout bench that was next to this tiny boiler heater thing. One day, my friend and I were sitting in the basement playing with some of my soldiers. You remember the little green plastic ones? I don't remember why, but I decided to take a break and sit on the workout bench. For some reason, I turned my head to look into the empty space above the heater, but it wasn't empty. Instead, there was this giant wolf's head in the space. Now, I have to tell you, this goddamn thing was jet black with enormous eyes and teeth that never ended, and it was just staring at me. I turned to my friend to see if he'd reacted to it, but he was still enthralled by the plastic soldiers. I glanced back at this wolf, and now it was snarling. Needless to say, I was terrified, so I grabbed my friend by the arm and we ran up the stairs, and I mean, we tore ass. I didn't tell him why we left in such a hurry because I didn't want to freak him out. Now, it took me years to go back into that basement by myself. I told my mom, and she just said it was a spirit guide or a protector. I don't know if she really believed that or if she was just trying to make me feel better, but I'll tell you this. If your basement creeps you out for some reason, don't linger in the shadows. Back in September of 2019, I had an encounter with a Dogman. Since then, I've done a lot of reading about these creatures, and the more I learned, the more I became sure that I was lucky to get out of that experience alive. It was early doe season in Michigan. My cousin wanted to go out on a hunting trip, and I decided to go out with him. He headed to the west side of the property, and I went to the east side. I went through our woods, then cut into the neighbor's property, who had given us permission to hunt there, and headed to the tree stand. Once I got close to the patch of woods behind the field, I felt a dark presence, but really didn't think much of it because it was still dark. Looking back on it, I should have gotten my ass out of there at that moment. Anyway, I took 2 steps into the patch of woods when I heard the deepest growl I've ever heard in my life. It's the kind of growl that vibrates all the way through you. I looked up to where the sound came from and saw 2 glowing eyes about 15 yards away from me and looking dead at me. I took the safety off my rifle. At that moment, the eyes instantly elevated, and I could see that the thing was standing. The only way I can describe this thing is as a gigantic wolf standing up like a man. It was easily 7 feet tall, completely black, and had tall, pointed ears. It had a muscular torso that narrowed down to a slimmer waist. I remember thinking to myself,
What the fuck do I do now? The creature turned and was gone in 2 running leaps. I reluctantly went to the tree stand to see if I could get another look at the thing, and all the while hoping it wouldn't come back. Thank God it never did. I used to enjoy hunting, but goddamn it all now. I don't like having to wonder whether I'm the hunter or the prey. The Freedom Riders were civil rights activists who rode interstate buses in segregated southern states to challenge the non-enforcement of the Supreme Court rulings that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. In short, southern states ignored the court decisions in order to maintain segregation. My name is Richard, and I'm proud to have been among the hundreds of young people to participate in that effort. On December 10th, 1961, we left the Atlanta Terminal Station on a Trailways bus bound for Albany, 183 miles to the south. Now, trust me, there wasn't a lot to see on those long stretches of Georgia highway once we were out of Atlanta. But the bus was filled with laughter, conversation, and transistor radios radiating the sounds of Ray Charles and Jackie Wilson. Anyway, we stopped in Cordele, which was only a small smattering of buildings, houses, and farms along the highway. So by stopped, I mean the bus pulled into an abandoned lot, mostly overgrown with weeds, and the lot looked to have been a gas station at some point. It was a good opportunity for everyone to stretch their legs, enjoy sandwiches, coffee, Coca-Cola, and cigarettes. 15 minutes later, the bus driver, a guy named Mike, came barreling around the corner yelling for everyone to get back on the bus. My first thought was like, shit, did the Klan show up out here? Because I knew for a fact that there were some brothers out here packing some firepower under their jackets. But there was just a brief moment of confusion. And again, Mike, the driver, reiterated in a much louder voice, "Get on the goddamn bus." And that was it. Everybody loaded onto the bus, still eating, sipping coffee, and smoking. Strangely, there wasn't too much made about why we had to get back on so fast, and it didn't take long for all the music and laughter to kick back up again. I can say this now because so many years have gone by. But a few miles down the road, Mike, our driver, took a fairly deep swig from his flask, and we kept rolling. When we pulled into Albany, I went up to ask him about what shook him up so much. He just looked at me, hesitated for a moment, and said, "A damn huge-ass wolf ran across the road." And I was like, "What? Man, there aren't that many wolves in Georgia, and aren't they mostly up in the mountains anyway?" He said, No, you don't understand. This motherfucker was running on 2 legs, and it had to be 7 or 8 feet tall. Of course, like I said, that was a long time ago. I know now that what he saw was the thing people call Dogman. Man, there's some crazy shit in this world. And based on what Mike said he saw, I'm glad it was him and not me. About 10 years ago, a close friend of mine named Tyler was a deputy in a small town in Michigan. He came over one evening and told me he had something to show me. Being the curious type, I was immediately interested in whatever it was and said, okay. We went about 5 miles up the highway, and then he took a turn down this old dirt road. After going another mile or so, we came upon a weekender's cabin. It was actually very nice and included a spacious loft. We got out, and he led me around the outside of the house and showed me where something had attacked the cabin. The aluminum screen doors had puncture holes where something had bitten straight through them.
There were puncture holes all around the door frames, and pieces of wood were laying on the ground where they'd been torn off the frames. The wood panels of one of the other doors had been splintered and cracked, as if something had pounded on them with incredible force. In the back, there was a huge picture window. It wasn't broken or even cracked, but what looked like saliva and blood were dripping down the window. Considering the position of the window, whatever attacked that cabin had to have stood about 7 feet tall. But there was more. He pointed out that all around the perimeter of the cabin, there were tracks. The ground there was fairly soft, and so anything with appreciable weight would leave prints. But these looked like huge paw prints. Now, by huge, I mean in comparison to the local wildlife. Black bear, foxes, coyotes, even bobcats. And these tracks were clearly padded, dog-type prints, but were at least 6 to 8 inches across. That's when he told me about reports of people seeing a strange creature that was called a Dogman. He said that the thing basically was a huge, wolf-like creature that could stand up and walk on 2 legs. Now I have to tell you, if I'd been hearing this from anybody else, I would have suggested that they re-up their medication. But Tyler was a rock-solid, straightforward, no bullshit type guy. He was very well liked and respected by everybody. The reports that he knew about came from a pair of hunters and a man named Benton who owned a local garage and auto parts shop. That's what got him to thinking about the cabin. See, Tyler knew the family that owned it. They would come out from Detroit once or twice a year and stay in it for a few weeks at a time. They would always check in at the sheriff's office when they hit town, and Tyler would typically drive out from time to time just to make sure they were okay. See, on that day that he'd taken me out there, he'd been out to check on the family that morning, and they weren't there. And that's when he discovered the weird tracks and the damage to the cabin. The scariest thing of all, the family left lights on and the radio playing when they left to deter burglaries. Whatever the thing was, it thought there were people inside. Later on, Tyler told me that he'd lifted samples of some kind of hair from some of the splintered wood of the door. The DNA hair samples came back and it was determined to be canine. Nothing else was said about the sample, and he wasn't able to get any information whatsoever about the blood and saliva. Something was really wrong when an experienced deputy sheriff got stonewalled on the results of forensic analysis. It meant that somebody was going to a lot of trouble to make sure that no definitive information about this thing got out. Someone, somewhere knew what was going on. They knew that this creature was real and extremely dangerous, and they weren't talking. It was a cover-up, plain and simple. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. Back around 20 years ago, I was visiting my great uncle in the region around Fredericksburg, Texas. And at the time, he was living in his first house in the area before he moved into a retirement community near a small set of trees. The trees were really beautiful, as it was in the hill country. I was staying with him and my great aunt for about a week when we went out for an evening to walk his dog, as we tended to do in the evenings in general. The walk was largely uneventful as the sun set, just a normal evening complete with the call of doves and other wildlife, and the dog was just having a wonderful time. Then, suddenly, all the wildlife went instantly silent, and both of us froze, as did the dog. I remember a feeling of distinct unease and fear growing in me, and I couldn't explain why. And the dog was looking directly in a specific area near a streetlight. I trained my eyes in that direction. I was shocked to see a creature loping through there. It was the beginning of an absolute surreal experience. The thing was something I first took to be a large dog, but it took only a split second to realize that this creature was far, far too large. Running on 4 legs, this thing was easily 4 feet at the shoulder and moved with a kind of motion that I'd never seen before. It looked hypnotic in a sense, and I was more terrified than I'd ever been with anything else I'd ever seen. I can't stress enough the true feelings of dread and horror that swept over me. And it was a visceral fear, as if we'd been thrust into some dark corner of H.P. Lovecraft's imagination. Now let me tell you something. Whatever this goddamn thing was, it looked like the biggest German Shepherd ever born times 5. And I couldn't help but notice its eyes too. They were fucking huge. And aside from having a weird orange-amber tint to them, they seemed to project an intent of total malice. The thing was powerfully built too. The upper limbs in particular were very well developed and easily seen beneath the dark fur. And again, the fear. Like I said before, it was a feeling as if I was being forced to experience every nightmare that I'd ever had. And then it got worse. The creature slowed its pace slightly and then came to a complete stop. It looked to the right and seemed to sniff the air. Then it raised itself up and stood on 2 legs. That's right. This gigantic monster wolf death machine stood up on 2 legs and darted off at a speed I can't even begin to describe, and it disappeared into the darkness. Now, like I said, at the time, I had no idea what this thing really was. But since then, I've learned that it was known as a Dogman. I've read online that a few skeptics say that something like a Dogman can't exist because the anatomy of a bipedal canine just doesn't work. Pure asinine bullshit. Zoology 101 class logic just doesn't apply here. Save that for Animal Planet. These creatures exist. I have no idea what they really are, where they come from, what their place is in the big scheme of things, or anything else for that matter. But I can tell you one thing for damn sure. It would be better for you to accept the reality of these things based on the encounters that you've heard or read about than for you to learn of the horror the way I did. You see, this creature, in just the span of a few minutes, was able to instill within me the bleakest, darkest landscape of terror. Within this monster, I discovered all the elements of fear. Just over 30 years ago, I had an experience that totally redefined my concepts of reality and fear. I've only rarely spoken of it, but I think now enough time has passed, and people should know about the existence of such things. This goes back to the winter of 1988. I was 20 years old at the time. I remember that day vividly, not just because of what ended up happening, but even before that. It was just one of those days that paints a permanent picture in your consciousness. The sunset was clear and golden through the cold, crisp winter air. I stepped out onto the porch, lit a cigarette, and caught the fading sunlight hitting the large abandoned barn on the property next door. The barn had always kind of creeped me out as a kid. It was filled with rusty old equipment. The outer planks were all rotten and it sagged and leaned in every direction. I remember as a boy my dad telling me to stay away from it as the whole thing could collapse. On that evening, though, I saw sunlight coming through the gaps in the siding of the old barn. But all of a sudden, something caught my attention. There was some movement. The light flickered, but I couldn't really tell what it was at first. Then whatever it was, turned its head back and looked straight at me. It was at least 6.5 or 7 feet tall, if not more. It was dark colored, and it had a dog or wolf-like appearance, pointy nose, and really big pointy ears. I ran into the house to grab a flashlight. When I got back outside, I shined it toward the barn door and caught the creature dashing out across the field toward the wood line. Now let me tell you, this thing was moving faster than any animal I've ever seen. Then for some reason it stopped, turned, and looked back at me dead in the eyes and stood up on 2 legs. For maybe 5 seconds our eyes locked, and it was the most horrifying 5 seconds of my life. It dropped back down on 4 legs and ran off until it disappeared into the woods. Somehow, I had the courage to walk out towards the barn to look for tracks. Nothing. The ground was cold and hard. Later on, I spoke to a neighbor who had seen something they described as the size of a buffalo but the shape of a wolf in the same barn a few months earlier. The neighbor said that he and his family had been so frightened by what they'd seen that they were in near hysterics for days. The man told me that he'd taken his shotgun and searched the barn, but found nothing there. So like I said, that was more than 30 years ago, and I can honestly say that talking about this now has brought back some very old feelings of fear and apprehension. One of the things I realized recently about what happened was how vulnerable I was at the time of the experience. The creature was so big and so fast that I know that it could have done whatever it wanted to. Back in the 80s, I didn't know the term cryptozoology, but I certainly knew then and read through the years about people who'd seen creatures like El Chupacabra, Bigfoot, Mothman, and also, of course, UFOs. I realized that if the creature that I encountered existed, then all of this shit was possible. And more than that, when I think of all the sightings and encounters with all of these things accumulating down through the decades, even centuries, I have no doubt that existing among us is a wild, bizarre menagerie of monsters. Before I get into this story, I need to give you just a brief background. First off, my wife and I are both from a very rural part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I always used to tell people that I had to drive 50 miles one way to go to McDonald's growing up. It's the type of place where, now that I go back to, you realize how very empty it is in those spaces between the towns. Anyway, on to the story. My wife was visiting family for the weekend in Upper Michigan and was driving home to Wisconsin early on a Sunday morning. She described the morning as cloudless and sunny and seemingly normal. She left town and was on the outskirts where there's few houses but a good number of fields. About 15 minutes into the drive, she said she saw something out of the corner of her eye out in one of those small fields. She said her first instinct before she focused on it was that it was a horse. You know how when you spot something like a dog in your periphery and your brain uses available info like movement and relative size, and all that says dog. She said that's exactly what happened, but her brain said horse. When she turned to look, she said she saw an absolutely gargantuan white or cream-colored wolf loping along the tree line in the field next to the road. She said it was trotting along casually in the field, but near the edge of the forest, and that other than the fact that it was huge, said it looked like a normal wolf. She said she was so stunned that she put on the brakes in the middle of the road and sat and watched for approximately 15 to 30 seconds. She confirmed in that time that it wasn't her mind playing tricks on her or a trick of the light or anything. She said it was literally a horse-sized wolf. Now, after those 15 to 30 seconds, she said it stopped, stood up on two legs, and looked directly at her, and then bounded into the trees. She got her phone out and called her dad, who said she probably just saw a big gray wolf. Now, we've both seen gray wolves, and while they are large, she said this thing wasn't even close. To her estimation, it stood 5 to 5.5 feet at the shoulder. That is, when it was on all fours. Now, for clarification purposes, I've actually seen the field she was talking about. It's maybe 50 yards from the road to the tree line, if that, and there are no obstructions. Along the edge are small spruce trees interspersed with larger oaks and whatnot. So there's a fair number of things for the eye to use as reference. She said she never lost sight of it until it went into the forest. Since then, we've learned that these creatures are usually referred to as dogmen. And based on what we've read and heard about these creatures, my wife said that she never wants to have that kind of experience ever again. And I don't blame her one bit. I want to tell you about an encounter with a dogman that changed my life. Now, before I get started, let me make something as clear as I can. What I saw was 100% real and 100% terrifying. And no, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a coyote, and it damn sure wasn't my imagination. It was in the evening, and my family and I were coming back from Chesapeake Beach, Maryland, from having dinner. It was me, my brother, mom, and dad. I was 16 and in the back right passenger seat talking football with my brother. Riding along, I was just looking out the window, and there was this little road that merges onto the main road to the left, so as we merged, we picked up a little speed. We were going maybe 25, 30 miles per hour. And you had to cross this little bridge, and it's really bumpy, so we slowed down even more. Once we did that, I looked up ahead, and about 35 to 40 yards ahead, I saw something standing on the wood edge off to the right a little, but it was exactly at the edge of the woods. It had both arms on a tree, just standing there, meaning its right arm was on the tree, about shoulder height, and its left arm was in basically the same position. So its arms were spread out with its hands on the trees. It was easily 7 feet tall, maybe even taller, and it had a wolf-looking face, only larger, like a dire wolf from Game of Thrones. It was dark too, almost pitch black, and the hair was medium length. I could see that its legs seemed to be arranged like a canine, you know what I mean? Kind of backwards, the way a dog or a wolf's would be. And then this fucking thing actually locked eyes with me. I saw it for about 15 to 20 seconds because of the distance. And I thought to myself, God
damn, what am I looking at? It had very pointy features and didn't look like how people describe a Bigfoot, but actually a werewolf. A lot of people call it Dogman, but I'm more inclined to say it was an actual wolf man. I said out loud to my family, "Did you guys see that thing?" And they were like, "See what?" To this day, my family still doesn't believe me, and most other people think I'm crazy or lying, so I very rarely tell anyone about it, but it was real. It was there, and what bothers me is I can never forget the look of those large, menacing yellow eyes. It had a look of pure evil. Are these kind of things out there all the time? And where do they go? And where do they come from? And what do they want? I want to share a story with you. A story that goes back more than a decade ago when I was 16, about to turn 17. You see, my dad got a call from a friend of his. His friend shot a huge 8-point whitetail buck and had lost it the night before in the woods. The deer was shot with a bow at sunset and ran into the woods across the road. My dad's friend called him at 8 at night and told him he'd need help finding it the next day. Dad asked me if I wanted to learn about tracking deer. I was all for it, because for me, hunting was an amazing experience. Next morning, we headed out. Now keep in mind, this was out on Maryland's eastern shore. Lots of woods, lots of hills, lots of walking. I was tired as hell and trying to retain what the two hunters were telling me. But for the most part, I was still having a really good time. We found a really long blood trail, including fur. The whole thing was exhilarating for me and my dad. But in truth, it was a little bit creepy too. Okay, so we'd been out there for maybe an hour or two. I decided to take a break near a small clump of trees that connected the massive expanse of woods where the blood trail went. My dad's friend went into the woods, and I was just looking at the trees, trying to spot a white belly or part of a rack of antlers. And almost as if on cue, it started raining. Shit! But it was then, through the raindrops, I caught sight of something, perched on 4 limbs, but it didn't make any goddamn sense at all. It was hard to see at first, and it's been about a decade. But I saw what looked like a damn wolf, or some kind of really large canine with a short to medium length muzzle, no tail, and really long limbs. Now, by long, I mean like deer length, but much thicker. This motherfucker was just standing there, maybe 20 yards from me, and I could see that it was either dark brown or black. That's not the weird part. That thing just kinda loped away. Like those cat videos on YouTube where the cat is scared and lifts its front feet off the ground and runs off on its back legs. It was similar to that, only it held its front legs higher and ran like that was the way it had run its entire life. Like that was natural for it to do. Hunched and hurried, but not wobbling. Now let me tell you motherfuckers something. I saw this thing for at least 15 to 20 seconds. And yeah, it seemed like an hour, but I don't need anybody telling me that I saw a bear or some other crazy shit. It was a large, monster-sized wolf. Dad scared the shit out of me by shouting about the 8-pointer being found. I told Dad I saw a weird animal, and he said it might have been a fox. I told him about the legs being weird and long, and that I thought it was way too big to be a fox. And then he gave me the look that says, "Stop making shit up." I got that look a lot. Well,
Anyway, I learned how to track, drag, and gut a deer that day. We took a trip to the butcher, and I got to watch it being processed. And that was that. As for what I saw, I've always had a big imagination, and I thought at first I could have just been sleep deprived, because getting up at 6 a.m. on Saturday is straight bullshit to a 16-year-old. But what I saw was real. It was strange and had an otherworldly quality to it that is very hard to explain. But what's not hard to explain? That it was goddamn terrifying.